Okay, I think we'll get rolling if you're good to go, Madeleine.
We're good.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Austin from the School of Cities, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session of Knowledge Café, featuring Madeleine Bonsma-Fisher. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The land in which the University of Toronto operates is the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and continues to be the gathering place of many Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples from all across Turtle Island. As we consider the push for equity and infrastructure in the lands we occupy, it is important to also remember the long-standing repercussions of colonial histories in our cities and their enduring effects to this day. Since not all of us are joining from the same location, I encourage you to consider these factors within your own living environment. The Knowledge Cafe is brought to you by the School of Cities, the University of Toronto's multidisciplinary center of urban research, education, and engagement, dedicated to discovering new ways for cities and the residents to thrive. The Knowledge Cafe is a monthly speaking opportunity for members of the tri-campus community at U of T to present insights and highlights of their research on a theme that is important and relevant to urban environments. It provides a platform for faculty, students, and researchers who are working to uncover solutions for creating more just, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous cities. Today's session of Knowledge Cafe features Madeleine Bonsma-Fisher, who will be discussing the interplay between optimal and equitable bike infrastructure. Madeleine studies how safe cycling networks influence the equitability of destinations people can access by bicycle in Canadian cities. She is the co-founder of UofT Coders, a group for graduate students to teach each other programming skills in a supportive peer environment. Madeleine is also a volunteer and board member with the advocacy group Bike Ottawa, and you can find her riding around Toronto on her beloved cargo bike. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few housekeeping things. Today's session is being recorded. We ask all attendees to keep their mics on mute for the duration of the presentation until the Q&A at the end. We encourage you to put any questions you may have throughout the chat, and they will be addressed at the end. And finally, please practice good etiquette. People demonstrating inappropriate behavior or language will be removed. Without any further ado, I'd like to hand today's session over to Madeleine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Austin. It's such a nice pleasure to be here today and see some familiar faces in the crowd. Hi, Mom. And I'm just so happy to be talking to you today about what I've been working on for the past year. So as Austin said, the big thing I want to talk about is this idea of where we build bike infrastructure and how we can think about applying data to assess what are the benefits of that infrastructure and how to decide where infrastructure should go. And I'll talk a lot more about what I mean by optimal and equitable, but that's just a little bit of an orientation. And the text here on the screen is almost exactly what Austin said, but I want to return to this idea of a land acknowledgement, which is not something that I did in my past life in physics, but because the work that I'm doing now is about physical infrastructure and the built environment and has the potential to change the physical environment, I want to emphasize that this is something I'm thinking about and I'm committed to learning from Indigenous transportation professionals and community members when we think about how we shape the land around us. And I am a settler on Indigenous land, and I'm committed to learning more about how that affects my work. And many of you may be aware of this resource, nativeland.ca, but it's a really amazing visualization of Indigenous lands across North America. And I'm showing kind of a snapshot of Southern Ontario here. So many of you here are here because you love to bike. That's why I'm here as well. And so I hardly need to tell you this, but biking is something that many places are thinking about as kind of a transportation revolution of the future. It's fun, it's low cost, it's healthy, it's good for the environment. These are some photos I took in Toronto on the left and in Ottawa on the right of people biking on infrastructure that's physically separated from cars. And I want to also mention here that the City of Toronto has a goal by 2040 that 75% of trips to school or work that are less than 5 kilometers will be made by a sustainable mode, so walking, cycling, or transit. And that is a huge fraction of trips, and many of those will be made by cycling. As many of us also know, though, so many places are not safe or comfortable to bike. These are photos that I took on a group ride earlier this year that was advocating for bike infrastructure to be extended east into Scarborough. And as you can see in the pictures, we're biking on a multi-lane road with lots of traffic and no specific dedicated space for biking. And so if we weren't in this group setting with lots of people, this would be a very uncomfortable situation to bike in. And many, many people would not be willing to bike in this environment. So I mentioned this briefly, but my background is in physics and not at all in transportation. But over the years of commuting by bike and by walking and transit, I became more and more interested in transportation and how we design our built environment. And so I'm just so delighted to be working now in my postdoctoral research on the topic that is closest to my heart, which is cycling and how we get around in cities. And these are some pictures of me biking on my beloved cargo bike with my son. And that's where you can find me often. So returning to the question that we want to talk about today, my research is really thinking about who benefits from bike infrastructure, and can we use data to think about where new infrastructure will have the most impact, and what are the different ways we can think about measuring impact. And I want to, if you come away with one thing today, I want you to come away with the idea that there are many different ways we can measure impact, and we do. And all of these different ways have different impacts on how we think about the benefit of bike infrastructure. So the framework that we use to talk about this is built on a classification system called level of traffic stress. And these classes are meant to kind of capture the physical characteristics of roads and paths and how they impact the feeling of biking on those roads. And these are based on surveys of adults where people would like to bike or where they do bike. And what these surveys find over and over is that a very small fraction of adults are willing to bike in situations where they're next to fast-moving traffic, even if it's a painted bike lane, or mixed with traffic. So these are what we would consider high-stress situations. On the other hand, almost anyone who is willing to bike at all, so about 80% of the people who would say they're interested in cycling, are only interested in biking where there's some sort of barrier protecting them from cars, whether that's a wide separation of painted buffer, or even more extreme, physical separation from cars, like an off-road path or protected cycle track. And so the creators of this categorization scheme added this fourth category for basically children to capture fully physically separated from cars infrastructure. And so this is meant to be a simple but kind of comprehensive way of thinking about the suitability of our network of roads and paths for biking. Everything I'm going to talk about today is built on this framework. And so I'll spend a bit of time introducing it and what it means for Toronto. So I'm going to, before I get into what I've been doing this past year, I want to start by talking about some earlier work that uses these tools and build up to what we're doing. So this is a map of downtown Toronto. Here's the Queen's Park area, if you're familiar with Toronto. And every road and path segment here has been colored by its level of traffic stress rating. So blue and green are what we consider low stress. Yellow and red are considered high stress. I mentioned this is from 2019, so you might, if you're paying very close attention, notice some differences, like University Avenue in Queen's Park now has a protected cycle track, so this would be green actually if we were to redo this map for today. But what I want you to notice when you look at a map like this for Toronto is a pattern that's common in very many North American cities, which is that while there is actually a lot of low stress infrastructure, most residential roads end up being rated low stress because they have low traffic volumes and low speeds. What we find is that there are often these islands of low stress pockets that are bounded by high stress roads that are typically arterial roads. So for the most part, without any sort of change, arterial roads are high stress for cycling. And so what this means is when we're actually thinking about where can you get to from A to B, you're kind of trapped in these pockets of low stress infrastructure that are surrounded by high stress. And in this paper, they asked exactly that question. They asked, from any origin in the city, how many destinations can you access if you bike for 30 minutes, but only on low stress, so LTS1 and LTS2 road segments? And again, this is meant to capture the fact that almost nobody is willing to actually bike on high stress roads. And what they found, consistent with that idea, is that the more jobs you could access using only low stress roads, the more likely you were to commute to work by bike. So there was a very strong correlation between the commute to work mode share by bike for an origin area in the city and the number of jobs that you could access around that area in 30 minutes using only low stress infrastructure. And so this is kind of the guiding idea behind what we're doing, is that providing access to destinations on low stress infrastructure is a way to actually capture whether people are likely to bike or not. And I also want to mention here, because we're going to use this idea of accessing jobs a lot, that we don't necessarily mean jobs as your specific employment, although that's part of it, but we also use jobs as a general measure of the attractiveness of destinations. So there are lots of jobs at, say, hospitals or grocery stores or movie theaters that are places that you might not work, but that you might also want to access. So just to add a bit more background and things that we can do with these metrics, I'm going to talk about another paper that looked at the change in bike infrastructure that happened during COVID in Toronto and how it impacted destination accessibility using this framework. So in 2020, Toronto added about 20 kilometers of COVID bike lanes. Those are shown in red and pink here on the map. So mostly here, there's a bike lane up here as well, and here. And so what this paper did was look at the change in ability to access destinations on a number of different categories because of these bike lanes. So I'm showing you just two results from the paper. The first is the difference in accessibility to jobs, again, within 30 minutes on low stress roads. And the second is the difference in the number of origins that could, or the number of people that could access one or more food stores, from going from 0 to 1 or more food stores. And there are two things I want to point out here. The first is that, so like I said, about 20 kilometers of bike lane were added, which is about a 4% increase in the total length of Toronto's bike network. But this had a much bigger effect on the accessibility to jobs, which increased by 22%. So we see this kind of knock-on synergistic effect of adding infrastructure to the network. When you add a small segment, it might be a very small piece, but it can open up lots of connections based on the existing network for people. The second thing is that what you're measuring and how you define that metric really affects the way the results look. So in the jobs panel here, this is the total increase in jobs. Doesn't matter where you started from, just the increase that you get from the bike lane. Whereas on the right on food, we're looking at the difference between accessing no food stores and accessing one or more. And so the jobs increase is most noticeable near downtown, whereas the increase, the threshold change in food access is more noticeable in these outerlying areas. So, you know, it's very likely that people downtown also increase their food store accessibility, but they may have gone from being able to access 10 food stores to 12 or from 30 to 32. And so that's not being picked up by this metric. And so I want us to keep in mind as we go forward that, you know, what we measure is having an impact on how we think about the result of adding infrastructure. And we're starting to see this idea of maybe a trade-off between the overall kind of net benefit of infrastructure and maybe an idea of a threshold of access or equity in access. Okay, so what I want to talk about for the rest of today is work that I've been doing the last year using an optimization framework that kind of combines all these ideas to try to evaluate which new potential infrastructure is going to have the most benefit. And so this is a model that was developed by Bo Lan, a PhD student in our group. And the way the model works is, in its base form, is to say, let's maximize the accessibility to jobs that you can access on low stress roads. And let's pick for a particular infrastructure budget. So let's say we're going to build 70 kilometers of bike lanes. Which high stress roads, which roads that are currently LTS 3 or 4, should we change to LTS 1 or 2 that are going to have the biggest impact on accessibility to jobs? So this image shows one solution of the model for this budget. In green is the proposed infrastructure that the model has selected to maximize accessibility to jobs. So I'm going to use this model, and I'm going to talk about, again, this idea of different goals in the model having different impacts and how this impacts equity. So let's take a little bit of a zoom out and look again at the entire city of Toronto and think about what we're doing and why. So this is the level of traffic stress map for the entire city of Toronto as of 2021. And what I want you to notice here is, again, there is a lot of green and blue, which is low stress. But the idea that cycling infrastructure is concentrated downtown is also basically true when we look at it this way, especially if you look at arterial roads, which are the thicker lines. You'll notice that almost all arterial roads in the more kind of outerlying areas of Toronto or suburban areas are yellow and red, so high stress, whereas there are more examples of green or blue arterial roads downtown. And in particular, this one here going east-west is Danforth and then Bloor, which has a protected cycle track. Here's University and Queen's Park, which now has a protected cycle track as well. And so when we talk about adding infrastructure, we're always doing it in the background of the existing network that we already have. And that's going to come up when I show you some of these results. So the other thing I want to keep in mind, a few more things kind of about Toronto's geography as we go forward. So I'm showing here the Ontario Marginalization Index, which is a composite score of marginalization developed for the province of Ontario that I'm just plotting for Toronto here. It depends on things like income, other measures of deprivation, residential instability, like fraction of renters and recent moves, concentration of ethnic minorities and recent immigrants, and dependency, so things like number of children and living alone and things like that. So it's meant to kind of, on aggregate, be a measure of marginalization. And in yellow here is areas that are high on this index, and blue is areas that are low, so low marginalization. And while it's not, uniform or even grouped into very clear sections in the city, there are patterns of marginalization that are larger in more outer-lying areas of Toronto, as well as a pocket of marginalization near downtown. And finally, again, on this idea of working in the background of the existing kind of network and land use patterns that we have, this is a map of the current state of accessibility to jobs on the cycling network in Toronto. So if we just take the metric before we do any optimization and look at how many jobs you can access within 30 minutes on low stress, this is what the map looks like. So yellow here is very high, blue and black is very low. And both because of the way the network is already set up and because of the way jobs and destinations are distributed in the city, job accessibility tends to be very high downtown and lower everywhere else. There are still pockets of low accessibility downtown. These black areas actually have zero accessibility in our metric. And that tends to be because they are still bounded by high stress roads. And so technically, we would consider them to be stuck in their origin. Okay, so what does all of this mean? We put all this together, we asked the model to choose the roads that will have the most impact on accessibility to jobs. And for a budget of 90 kilometers, the model has selected these projects in gray. And what I want you to notice is that they're very clustered near downtown. In green is the existing cycling network, which is painted bike lanes, cycle tracks, and paths that I'm showing. And even though we have not said anything about downtown or specifically prioritizing downtown or Old Toronto area in that general sense, these are the projects that are going to cause the biggest increase in accessibility to jobs as in the background of the existing network that we have. So what I asked in this model is, let's do something a little different. Let's, instead of optimizing for the entire city of Toronto, let's split the budget into smaller pockets for different regions of Toronto. And we chose to do this for the pre-amalgamation boundaries of the city for a couple of reasons. So that's Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, Old Toronto, East York, and York. And we chose these boundaries because before the late 90s, these were actually separate political entities that were making their own decisions. And so we wanted to think about, how does region-based or local planning compare? And also because these boundaries are still culturally and politically meaningful in Toronto today. So I'm doing the exact same optimization, but splitting the overall budget for the city into 6 for each of these regions and then running the model. So I'm going to show you the results from that now. Again, I'm taking this 90-kilometer budget, giving 15 kilometers to each pre-amalgamation region, and then I'm going to show you the combination of projects that each of the regions selects. So the same total budget, but different optimization goals. So taking off the old network, just so it's easier to see, this is in gray, the citywide solution, the projects that the city has selected, or that the optimization model has selected for the entire city of Toronto. And I'm going to add now the favorite projects for each region individually. So in orange here are East York's favorite projects. These are Scarborough's, Etobicoke's, York's, North York's, and Old Toronto. And so the total length of all of the colored projects is still 90 kilometers, but the pattern is different. And in particular, what I want you to notice is that the end result is that the infrastructure plan is more spread out. So by asking the model to prioritize specifically each region individually, it caused the projects to kind of pull to the outer edges of Toronto. But there's still connecting as best as they can to parts of the network that are already more dense near downtown Toronto. The second thing I want to point out when we do this is the impact of where we tell the model to look for projects. So we could say to the model, you can only choose a project if it is touching your region. So in orange here, I'm showing for North York, the projects that the model has selected that are within or touching the region. But we can also allow the model to select products that are outside the region. And the intuition for this is that somebody could start in North York, and in 30 minutes, they can get to quite far away in other parts of the city that are not North York. And so when we're talking about destinations that somebody starting in North York can access, there's kind of a big ring around North York that's part of that. And so when we let the projects be anywhere in the city, we find that sometimes the best project for accessibility for North York is actually in purple here outside of the region. And in particular, they're again connecting down to downtown Toronto. And so this kind of changes our idea of who infrastructure is for. There's this idea very commonly that being near infrastructure means that you're benefiting from it. And when we're talking about transportation, which is moving through space, especially when we're talking about moving quickly through space like biking, there's actually a potentially a large spatial difference between where you start and where you end. And so we have to think about, you know, all of the places you might traverse on your journey, not just where you start your journey. So, okay, everything I've told you so far has under the hood this assumption of what our optimization goal is, which is that we're trying to maximize the total benefit. Even when we're splitting the budget by region in Toronto, we're still trying to maximize the total accessibility to jobs, and we're ignoring anything to do with where you start. So if you're going from, if your origin can access 500,000 jobs and now you can access 700,000 jobs, the model considers that a better result than if your origin goes from being able to access 100 jobs to 200 jobs. But if we're talking about equity and we're thinking about what is actually, you know, necessary and fair, we might want to go towards the idea of a threshold of sufficiency. So what actually is enough accessibility? You know, do you really need to access 32 grocery stores if you can already access 30? Whereas going from 0 to 2 might have a much bigger impact. Now, we don't actually know what this threshold is. And that's something that people are starting to really work on, is can we actually figure out what would be a minimum threshold of access that people can meet all of their needs. But we can still work towards this idea of prioritizing regions that have currently low access as trying to move people towards this threshold. So I'm going to show you another version of the model now that tries to take a more sufficientarian approach. And so again, just to remind you, now what we're doing when we look at this original map of job accessibility is I'm going to change the model's optimization goal to instead try to prioritize connections to origin regions that currently have low accessibility. So that's the blue and black areas on the map. And the origin region that we use is the census dissemination area. I'm just going to say this because I use this abbreviation later. So these are small spatial units, and we're going to try to connect to dissemination areas that have low original accessibility. So this is the result of changing the model to prioritize low original accessibility in red, compared again to the citywide optimal solution in gray, trying to maximize accessibility to jobs. And kind of similarly to the region-specific version, the infrastructure plan ends up more spread out, but still grouped near downtown. So it's pulling a little bit out to the edges as well, but the question now becomes, how do we actually quantitatively compare these? So I want to talk now about kind of quantitatively understanding what the impacts of different infrastructure plans might be and how they impact equity and marginalization. So why do we care about marginalization when we're talking about cycling? So this is census data for commute to work mode share. And the main takeaway here that I want you to remember is that for the most part, commuting to work by car increases as income goes up, except for at the very highest 10% of income. And then in combination with that, commuting by other modes such as transit, walking, and biking becomes more common as you go towards lower income. So when we're talking about cycling, and being able to access things, especially things like work potentially, even though there's lots of other things people do access, this is an equity issue. And it's something that we really need to keep in mind when we're talking about a fair transportation network. And I'll show you again this map of the entire marginalization index group by Toronto. And again, there's these pockets of marginalized areas kind of in more suburban parts of Toronto, as well as a pocket of marginalization downtown. And just, again, keep this in mind as we talk about these marginalized groups. So I'm going to show a few plots that are on the same axes. So I want to just take a moment to explain. What I'm going to show you is the fraction of origins, so the fraction of census dissemination areas in Toronto that meet some threshold of job accessibility. The threshold is the number on the x-axis, and I'm showing it as a fraction of the total jobs you could access. So if you pass this 10 to the -1 threshold, that means you can access by bike on a low stress network in 30 minutes, 10% of all of the jobs in the entire city of Toronto. And because you can only go 7.5 kilometers in 30 minutes of biking, nobody is going to reach 1 on this metric, but that's kind of the way to think about this threshold. And so I'm going to show you now, before any optimization, the fraction of origins that meet this threshold broken down by this marginalization index. And the main takeaway here is that if we look at the least marginalized group in dark blue here, they enjoy the highest levels of access. So they have the highest fraction of origins that pass thresholds, basically at all thresholds, until you get to the very, very highest level of accessibility. And so what's going on the very top end here is kind of the downtown story, where there's also marginalized groups downtown that have high access to destinations, but then the pockets of marginalization in the outer parts of Toronto are really driving this trend that overall, the most deprived, most marginalized groups also have the lowest accessibility to jobs before we do anything else. So I'm going to take out this bottom 20% here, this yellow line, and I'm going to show you some results just for the origins that fall into this category. So again, using the same axes, the fraction of origins that pass the threshold, how many of those 20% most marginalized origins meet this threshold under the different optimization goals that I talked about. So again, before we do anything, this is what the curve looks like. Most of the origins pass, or actually only 40% even pass this lowest threshold. That's because many of them actually have zero accessibility and they aren't even showing up on this plot. And a few already enjoy high accessibility. Now I'm going to add the results for each optimization method individually. So when we look at the first model I showed you, maximizing the accessibility to jobs over the entire city, it increases the fraction that pass the threshold kind of all across the board. So it gives more origins that pass the threshold at the low end, but also at the high end as well. And now it gets interesting when we look at the other two models. So if we look at this region-specific version where the budget is divided into the pre-amalgamation regions, it also boosts everything across the board, but the increases are actually higher at these kind of intermediate levels of the threshold and lower at the very high end. So when we're thinking that our goal is maybe to prioritize areas that have low accessibility, this model is actually causing more origins to pass the threshold if the threshold were to be lower down, like near 10 to the -2. And likewise, when we explicitly ask the model to connect origins that have low accessibility, it also means that more origins pass the threshold when the threshold is at this intermediate value. And just for some context, I'm showing here in these dashed lines the original citywide mean accessibility and the citywide median. And so the fact that these are so different tells us already what we saw on the map, that there's a high variability between areas that have low access and areas that have high access. And also that many of these methods are doing better for origins that are near the original median than at the very highest levels of accessibility. So here's another way of kind of looking at the impact of these different models on the least marginalized and most marginalized 20%. So now instead of showing the fraction that are passing a threshold, I'm showing the difference. So basically I'm showing the each of these colored lines minus the green line in each of these plots as a function of the threshold. And so the dashed line here for each of these models is the least deprived 20%. And the solid line is the most deprived 20% of origins. And the takeaway here is that for most of the models, they benefit the least deprived origins as well. This is something that is always going to be a feature of the way the patterns are in Toronto. But in contrast to the citywide utilitarian optimization for total accessibility, both the region-specific version and this optimization specifically for minimum accessibility give more of a boost to deprived regions at low thresholds. So there's kind of two axes here of need, but one is marginalization in terms of the most deprived 20%, and the other is the low thresholds, so areas that already had low thresholds, low accessibility initially. Okay, so I've talked, that all sounds great. I think at this point you might be thinking, well, why wouldn't we just explicitly optimize for areas that have the most need? That seems like kind of a win-win. But I want to now talk about this idea of a trade-off, which is the title of the talk, trade-offs between optimal and equitable. And so I want to preface this by saying there's many different ways we could choose to measure this, and this is still up for debate in my own work and in general. And I made this plot this morning, so you're the first people to see it, which is very exciting for me and hopefully for you. So what I'm showing on the y-axis is the average job accessibility for each origin across the city. So you just take the total increase, just divide it by the number of origins. And again, origin here is census dissemination area, which is DA. On the x-axis, I'm showing the average accessibility per DA, but only for those DAs that were below the mean accessibility originally. So here, my conception of equity is thinking about areas that had low access initially. And again, there's many different ways we could measure this, and I would be so happy to discuss what those mean and what they, different ways to do that. So to start, here's the original before we do anything. The average job accessibility for origins in the city is over 60,000 jobs. But then if you just look at the origins below the mean, it's somewhere more than like 5,000. So these numbers are very different. Again, there's such a huge variability in what people can access that's why these numbers are very different. And I'm going to show different curves as we increase the total budget for infrastructure. So if we say we're going to build 120 kilometers of infrastructure, the citywide utilitarian model produces this boost, this quite large increase to average accessibility and a small increase to the average accessibility for the lowest origins. The other two, the minimum accessibility version and the region-specific version, produce a lower overall average, but higher averages for the lowest end of accessibility. So this is the idea of the trade-off, is that the overall average is lower, but that there's some other benefit specifically for the origins that have lower accessibility initially. And this trend keeps going as we increase the budget. But the other thing I want to mention here is that while there is this starting idea of a trade-off, the actual differences in numbers here are not that big on the x-axis. So you could also argue that actually all of these models are having a very similar impact on accessibility. Each of them does increase the overall average, and they have kind of similar impacts on the accessibility for the lowest, the below the mean accessibility origins. So again, there's many ways to think about this, and depending on the metric I use, you might see something different. And that's something that we're still kind of trying to think about. So to conclude, the last thing I told you is that we're starting to see this evidence of a potentially small but there trade-off between efficiency overall in terms of the total access that you get from your infrastructure budget and how much the impact is on equity. So if you have more access overall, this means less access for specific equity-seeking groups or areas that have low accessibility. Earlier, I also showed you that we might find that projects that are outside a region are actually best for that region, which is maybe a counterintuitive or politically interesting results. And finally, that one of the benefits of these other ways of optimizing is that when we optimize for areas that have the lowest accessibility originally, so sufficientarian approach, we got lower overall accessibility, but we saw that there was benefit specifically for the areas that had low access and the areas that were most marginalized. So I will end there and specifically want to thank Bo, the PhD student who made this model that I'm working with, and my supervisors, Shoshana and Tim.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. That was a really interesting talk. We'd like to open the floor up to questions now. To get the ball rolling, we did have one in the chat throughout the talk. So Mark asked, can your model of optimization be applied to caregiver trips? So for example, schools, hospitals, libraries, etc.
Yes, so the way that we would do that is we would change the destination parameter. So right now we use jobs as this kind of general purpose catch-all attractiveness of destinations, but we could easily change that to specifically a basket of destinations that we think captures caregiving. So we could make that schools, medical facilities, food stores, for instance. And that earlier paper that I showed you had broken those destinations into some of those categories. And I think that's very interesting and can tell a story about, you know, another axis of need and of equity is this idea of like different trip purposes and who's tending to making different trips.
And Allison is asking, will you be submitting your recommendations for Toronto's 2025 to 2027 cycling network plan based on your research?
Yes, we are talking to the city about how to integrate some of this into their plan. Yes.
So then we also had some questions submitted before the talk. So one is, how can we apply these learnings, not just in Toronto, but in other places around Ontario, from Kitchener-Waterloo, for example, to medium large towns, so based on your own experience?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts about this. The first is just on a practical level, this framework can definitely be run elsewhere. So the ingredients that you need are, you need the level of stress map, and you need a list of projects that you're going to consider. So in our case, we chose to look at arterial roads that are currently high stress, but you could define that however you like. And then the destinations that you want to access. And if you have that data for a region, you can just basically press go on the model and run it. But that said, we have not done that yet because there's obviously more intricacies in gathering the data for different areas. And the other thing we kind of want to emphasize is that many of the patterns in Toronto about how the land use is set up and how marginalization is distributed and how the cycling infrastructure network is developing are true for many different cities. So it's very common in, I think, many North American cities to have kind of more well-developed bike network downtown and to have this changing landscape of marginalization where there's potentially marginalized areas downtown and also in the more outer regions. So if that's true, if those general patterns are true, then many of these results will be similar in those areas.
Following up on that, Patrick is asking, how do we access this model if we have that data?
Another great question. So we are planning to make this into a more like interactive dashboard as well that can be used by people. It does not currently exist, but that's the plan. Yeah, that's what we would love to see.
And kind of just to follow up on the previous question, based on your experience, which other North American cities outside of Toronto have the best policy framework or built infrastructure that we can draw from or emulate from?
This is tough because there are, I think, many good examples for different reasons. I think one that we often in the advocacy world look to with jealousy is Montreal, which I think Montreal, because of their slightly different political structure, they're able to kind of move a little quicker sometimes and just kind of build stuff. And that's having an impact. But then I lived in Ottawa for 3 years, and Ottawa has a really amazing network of trails. And I would say the connections between the trail infrastructure and the road infrastructure is better in Ottawa than in Toronto. There's lots of places are trying interesting things, I think, that we can learn from.
Patrick had another question in the chat. You mentioned Toronto's plan for how many people they want using active transportation by 2024. What are the current numbers, if you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure, actually. I know that the cycling, well, okay, so the cycling commute mode share is basically the only data that we have, because sadly the census doesn't ask about other utilitarian trips. But I believe that there are some neighborhoods in Toronto that have about a 12% commute mode share for cycling, which is what would be the high end. The national average is about 2%. But that's just cycling. So that number for the city of Toronto, their goal also includes transit and walking, I believe. Maybe there's somebody from the city or somebody else here who knows what that current number is compared to the goal.
I was looking through a couple of the other questions we have. So another question we have, unless there's one. How do we as practitioners go about prioritizing areas of the cycling network where there isn't a high potential for mode share and typically in areas with less density but higher equity deserving groups? Any content this would be great, would be very useful.
I think measuring potential cycling is very hard, and we don't really have a way to do that right now. The model is trying to kind of capture that as a proxy for that is saying like, okay, here's destinations you could access, which is a way of thinking about potential demand. I'm going to quote Darnell Harris from is it Our Greenway or Community Bike Bice? Darnell Harris, who told me that one reason why cycling might be particularly important in these areas is that if you're thinking about outlying areas of Toronto that are kind of far apart, where destinations are far apart, and it might be prohibitively far to walk, cycling might be actually the ideal way to access destinations. You know, we think of it as a downtown thing potentially, but it might even be more important in these areas where destinations are far apart. And I think we have seen evidence of this, and it's basically true that if you build it, people will use it. So we just have to build it.
There's actually as a follow-up question to that. Somebody else also asked, how do we reconcile that people don't cycle where it is less safe, for example, suburban arterial roads, with building specialized infrastructure first, where people already cycle?
Yeah, this is a great question. So there are places that are currently unsafe, but also have high usage. And there are places that are unsafe that don't have high usage. And all of these places should be safe. And I think the real push behind this work is acknowledging that we will never be able to build everything at once. And how can we think about the benefits in different areas? I don't have a good answer for this because every answer has a trade-off, and the trade-off is often has real consequences in terms of safety. But I think, we have to think about the network as a whole, and we have to think about providing connections to things. And, I hope that I think the city's network plans are great, and hopefully we can just do it quickly.
So in your opinion, what is the role of e-bikes in such infrastructure? I know there's some people have concerns that they're a lot more efficient or they're a lot more dangerous. So how do you feel on that?
Yeah, I'm still thinking through the e-bike thing. I have an e-bike, so I'm biased. I love my e-bike. My personal opinion, I'm just going to say it's my personal opinion, is that e-bikes are an important part of the kind of micromobility landscape, and they're only going to be more important, and we should definitely assume that people will be riding them. And the simplest way to make that comfortable and safe for everyone is just to make wide infrastructure so that people can pass safely. I think that's kind of the trend in the policy space, is that people are just acknowledging that the devices are there, and that there's a wide variety in the types of things people are riding that are not cars or not even close to cars. And that the best way to accommodate them is to just give more space for non-car uses.
Here's a far-reaching, maybe idealistic question, but in your opinion, would Toronto ever consider making some streets car-free and switching to pedestrian or bicycle only?
I would love it if they did. I think Toronto is pretty far behind some other cities in North America and Montreal in trying this. And there's, you know, I think I would not have a job if we just made half of the grid pedestrian only, then we would be done. That's very cheap and easy to do. So we could just do that.
Okay, we have two questions in the chat. Patrick's asking, is it true that we plan how we get people around our urban areas? So we don't also need a good automobile network to complement a good active transportation network. For example, to allow people biking and walking to take the most direct and safe route.
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure I understood it.
Is it true that we can plan how we get people around our urban areas? So that we don't also don't we also need a good automobile network to complement a good active transportation network? For example, to allow people biking and walking to take the most direct and safe route.
Okay, so I think this is kind of saying like walking and biking can build off of the directness or the completeness of the automobile network. And I agree. I think that's true. I would say, first of all, that we have an amazing automobile network already. Like that's been the focus of planning and transportation for the last 80 years. And, if every road that we have was safe for walking and biking, then we would be done. I think there would be direct routes to everywhere that we need to go. So yes, I agree. But I think we're kind of, we could consider that part done, the automobile planning part. In terms of actually making it safe for cycling, part of that can involve making it worse for driving actually, or making driving take longer, or restricting the routes that people can drive to disincentivize driving. And all of those can have the counterintuitive impact of actually reducing the amount that people drive. So just as induced demand works where we, build more lanes on the highway and more people drive because the time to travel has gone down, the same thing works in reverse, where if we make it take longer to drive a route, people will drive less.
Oh, we have one other question, but just Patrick had a follow-up before. To follow up, do we need to create less direct routes for vehicles?
Yeah, I think that's what I just said. I agree. And I think that's been tried in some Dutch cities and it's been pretty effective. The caveat here is that, we will always need vehicle access for certain reasons, for things like deliveries, for transit, for people with disabilities. But there's a pretty big difference between allowing all vehicles and allowing just vehicles from those categories. And we don't really, I think, take it seriously enough that we could try limiting overall vehicle access to areas in favor of specific categories of vehicle access.
Okay, so then a question from Cassandra. Are you working with any neighborhoods that are currently undergoing cycling infrastructure projects, for example, Young Tomorrow, where this research can help guide, support, provide, or inform on where to build cycling infrastructure more ideally based on equity, accessibility, etc.?
We are currently not working with any specific projects, but I will say that the Midtown Young Complete Street, for that project, this was before I joined the group, but this model was applied to 3 different candidate projects for the Midtown Complete Street, and found that Young Street provided the highest accessibility, and that was one of the data points that was used to select Young Street. So definitely it is part of the future plan, is to think about how these metrics can be integrated into the plan that the city already does.
Okay, we're just coming up at the end of our time here. I just want to give space for any last minute questions. I just want to ask, what are your next steps for this project going forward?
I think the big things are, I'm pretty excited about the idea of making a dashboard or a pathway into the model that people can access, and play around with the results and try out their own favorite project and see its impact on accessibility. I think that would be really cool. So that's one aspect. And the other thing is I still feel like there's a lot to be done in terms of thinking about all the different ways you could measure equity and what those impacts are. And, there's not just one right way to do this. And that's kind of the point, I think.
And I think that is an excellent point to end on, unless anybody else has any more questions. But if not, I just want to say thank you to you, Madeleine, for an amazing presentation, and to all of our attendees. The School of Cities has a lot more amazing initiatives coming up. I'm just posting a link in the chat. And yeah, thank you, everybody.